Empire and early modern Europe. Our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Patricia Graham-Skoul, is an adjunct professor in the Department of Classics at Loyola University, Chicago. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Latin from Loyola University and MA and PhD degrees in classics from Northwestern University. Her research interests focus on Greek lyric poetry and ethical values, and on artistic and literary imagery associated with the representation of women in Greek and Roman society and pedagogy. Her most recent paper on Sappho has been Sappho's Ethical Trajectory of Desire. The lecture will be followed by a questions and answer session. You can type your question at any time by clicking on the QA button at the bottom of your screen. Then a screen is going to open and then you can type your questions. Those who attend the event on Facebook can type their question in the comments box, which is at the bottom or bottom right part of the screen. And because I will not be able to see these questions will be communicated to the lecturer by Stefanos Sakelaridis, who will be attending the event on Zoom and on Facebook. Dr. Graham, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to presenting my talk on Sappho today. I also want to thank, again, you and Sam and Stefanos for having this preliminary meeting that we had last Wednesday, both for terms of settling some of the technical questions that are always necessary when we're doing this new medium, and also for the opportunity of being able to meet you and talk with you and to share some information about different thoughts about ancient Greek society. I very much enjoyed that informal part of our talk last Wednesday. I also want to thank very much Denise Barris, who was the person who recommended me to you. And talking about memory and thinking in terms that that's really behind this, the fact that she and my husband, George, are members of the Polychore group and celebrates their ancestors. So it's wonderful for me to be talking today to you. Should I be able to maybe go to my screen right now to my presentation and in this talk, I'm going to be dividing it into two parts, approximately half and half, about 20-25 minutes each. And it's on Sappho, remembering Sappho, the tradition, and the poet. The first half of my talk will be looking at the tradition, which involves what do we know about Sappho? How do we know what we think we know about Sappho? I will be very covering 2,600 years in just a few minutes. That will be not doing nearly enough credit to the importance of this topic. But I have available, if you'd like, some sources that if you're interested in particular periods to learn more about them. The second half will be on the part that I think is, for me, is even more important because it's about Sappho herself. What is in her poetry? How does she present a view of life that makes it important for her to be continued through these years? And I'm thinking as I look out my window at this snow-filled landscape that we have with the gray sky, that this is a perfect time to be looking at Sappho and remembering all and thinking about remembering when we have sunny weather and lots of green plants around us. In my abstract, I refer to this song, a reference to the importance of Sappho for an early Greek. And I think it's important, not just in the fact of what Solon is said to have said, but the fact that this also is an example of tradition. Supposedly Solon had been at a drinking party, a symposium, and his nephew sang some song that was by Sappho. Solon liked it so much that he then asked his nephew to teach it to him. And somebody asked, why did you want to learn that? And hear it, he said, so that I may learn it and I may die. And for those of us who know the Greek tradition, and I'm sure this may fit in with contemporary as well, was the sense that the Greeks thought that the best time to die was when you're at the very height of your powers. And so the fact that Solon said, who was a famous politician as well as a poet himself, and sometimes some would say the father of democracy, the fact that this would be the moment that not when he was at his heights as a politician, but having heard Sappho, that is when he would be ready to die, I think is very moving. And also when we look at the tradition, as it were, is embodied. We have Solon, who lives around the time of Sappho, 640, 560 approximately, and supposedly has been quoted from a man named Aelian, who lived in the 2nd, 3rd century CE. And that, in fact, his work is not extant, but it was conveyed by another poet or compiler of information, Stobaeus, from the 5th century, shows us that Sappho has had this long-lasting conveyance of her poetry, and also by men, as well as important for women. But the fact that Solon wants to learn this, and that later authors recount supposedly his saying it, wouldn't have been a surprise to Sappho, because as she told somebody in one of her poems, somebody, I say, will remember us. People will remember her in art, as depicted on this pot, and as she's playing a lyre. This would be the representation that we often see of Sappho. She is with a musical instrument. Often she's by herself. Other times she's with a group of individuals. But she is remembered as this famous poet. In fact, Plato was said to have called her the 10th muse. And that brings us to the topic of memory. A neurobiologist, James McGaugh, claimed that we are memories. He talks about in his book of how the brain integrates the combined effects of past and present experiences to create thoughts and influence actions. But memory is not just what we remember from our own lives, but as Ella claims, there's also a sense of social history. The fact that the information that we have has been remembered and conveyed through the years. And it actually affects the disposition with which we approach the topics. So we find that Sappho is going to be an individual who refers to memory in a number of important poems, and a couple we'll look at today. And she herself is the one who has been remembered through all these years, because there's something that she says that is worthwhile remembering, something that helps us understand what we can appreciate with life. And I would argue also will help us not just appreciate life, but to give us courage in times that seem like we are totally at a loss, and maybe all the more important in times that we're going through these recent years here in America. So who was Sappho? She lived around the year 600 BCE, and she lived on this island, Lesbos. She's associated with two cities, Mytilene and Erissos. Lesbos is close to what we call Asia Minor, modern day Turkey right there. And it was in ancient Greece, it was a part of one of the ethnic groups would be Aeolian. The Greeks identified themselves in terms of where their ancestors came from. And we find Athens and some of these city-states on the coast of Asia Minor are going to be Ionians. We look to Sparta to look at some of the important Greek cities, and we think of the ethnic identity of the Dorians. Sappho was an Aeolian poet, actually from the same grouping as the great epic poet Hesiod. Homer would have been from an area, Chios, which would have been Ionian, so different groups. But Lesbos was the home not only of Sappho, but her contemporary Alcaeus, and then Orion and Terpander in the earlier times. But Sappho, you'll notice, is the only woman in this group. We don't know much about her life from what she says. She does refer to two brothers, Chroxus and Larichus. She refers to a child who might very well be her daughter, named Cleis. And she also has a couple of poems to her mother, including one that's to to her daughter about her mother. And that gives rise to the thought, if the daughter is Claeus, it may very well be their mother has the same name. We do know that she was very much a devotee of the goddess Aphrodite and the Muses. And in one poem, it seems that she actually refers to herself as the servant of Aphrodite. Her poems are usually known as about love, but I would say it's even more about, in general, about human relationships. And although these poems, for the most part, are all about poems of love, poems of suffering, poems of loss, and then how to deal with that loss, but they've also been seen to have references that are not quite just an aesthetic sense, as we would believe, but actually may have a political point, because some of the women she criticizes come from families that were criticized by her contemporary Alcaeus. And it's this sense of political competition right here that's going on that may very well be related to what we find in later sources, that is, that she had been exiled to Sicily because of political stasis. As such, she would have suffered comparably to what Alcaeus, although we don't know exactly where Alcaeus was exiled to. Some possible reference to this exile to Sicily, about which she says absolutely nothing from what we have, is that if we look ahead to the Roman period, Cicero refers to Verres having stolen some statue of Sappho from the island of Sicily. And given the connection between ancient Greece and the southern part of Italy and certainly of Sicily, all of which had been colonized by Greek city-states, we can assume that there might very well be some truth to that. We also think in terms of the political prominence, as well as the poetic, is that we have a number of coins from the little later period, the Roman period, 1st, 3rd century, that depict the Sappho with her name on the coin on one side, and then on the other side a lyre and the name either of the city Mytilene or of Erissos. Sappho does not ever refer to her husband or her father, but the later sources have provided some names, as you can see here. Her husband's name, Cercolas of Andros, is sometimes made thinking maybe this is some pun on manhood. And we don't know if that actually was his name, but that's just part of the tradition. And so I'm conveying it to you. Probably most popular though from the other stories about Sappho, and the one that has had a very important effect in later literature, both in antiquity and modern times, is the story that she had fallen in love with the handsome young man, a ferryman named Phaon, that when he rejected her love, she threw herself over the cliffs of Leucas. Naj has an interesting interpretation of what this may well mean, which has nothing to do with actually physical suicide. And Sappho herself never refers to Phaon and never refers to suicide, but she does refer to how hard life can be. And so this may be possibly an influence on that tradition. But again, how she was seen later times is as a poet. The artwork that we have, the pottery, will often show her with other women, either alone, as in the pot we looked at earlier, or the one on the right, in which she's with a group of other women. But also what I want you to note is that we also have this one very famous pot right here, this Calathus, in which we have Sappho with her contemporary Alcaeus. One point is that although the tradition would be that a man would be taller than a woman, that the fact that they're the same height, I think is very worth noting, because the Greeks in their art will represent individuals of importance as larger than the other individuals. For example, with a deity is always going to be, or a hero, and if it's a ritual activity that's being depicted, is always much larger than any people right here. So the fact that Sappho is depicted as equal in height with Alcaeus might very well be pointing to the fact that, yes, she's as equal in his poetic prominence as well. It also ties in with a comment that we find in Aristotle's Rhetoric. Aristotle is talking about an ethical comment right here. He's distinguishing between what is good and not so good, what's shameful. And he says that Alcaeus had said to Sappho that he wanted to say something, but he was embarrassed. He was ashamed to say something. And in return, this is what Sappho had said. But if you had a desire for the good and the beautiful, and if your tongue was not stirring up to say something bad, shame would not hold fast your eyes, but you would speak out what is right. I want to call attention to this poem because we don't usually think of Sappho as an individual who's concerned with ethical topics. But the fact that Aristotle chooses her as the conveyor of ethical advice, of a statement that would be useful for men as well as women, as well as the fact we have this literary reference that can be seen as possibly connected with the artwork is worth noting. The fact that Sappho had this reputation, I think, is all the more striking because of the period in which she lived, in which women are always represented as inferior or at least subordinate to men. In fact, in the 5th century, the great politician, orator Pericles, proclaimed at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian Wars that concerning a woman's excellence, her virtue, her reputation, her fame, that greatest will be that of the woman who's least talked about among men, whether for good or for bad. I mention this because Sappho seems to be quite the opposite. She has a fame, and it is, as we can see, both for good and for bad. She was very popular by the Greek authors. We find that there are stories about her in the comic playwrights. We also have a reference to one of her contemporaries in which we have Anacreon, who's from a little bit later than she is, about a generation later, refers to the fact that he's in love with some girl, but she's not paying any attention. But no wonder, she's from Lesbos. The playwrights of the 5th century look again at Sappho in terms of sexual feelings. There's not sexual orientation, however, this time is going to be of heterosexual because it's referring to the love, supposedly, that she had this vow on. So we're going to find, in reference to what Sam had indicated, that there was this controversy, particularly, who was this Sappho? Was she this a wanton female? Some people would refer to her as a prostitute, but others as this very chaste maiden, the purveyor of wisdom. We find that the Aristotle, though, to look at the other view of her, is not alone, that Plato himself had also referred to her and the poetry of Anacreon as images of love that he was looking at in his story about the Phaedrus. When we move on, we'll find that this is not surprising. I mean, that her fame is surprising because if we go back to that first slide that I showed, the saying of Solon, remember he heard this song at a symposium, a drinking party. And a drinking party with men is not where Sappho ever would have been. I have a representation right here, which is typical of pottery. If a woman is depicted on one of these pots, she's either going to be a flute girl, she might be a wine pourer, or she might be a sexual companion of a man, but she's not going to be seen as an equal of him. And so I want to just point out again the fact that there was something about Sappho that these male authors and painters kept coming back to, even though the usual role of a woman was going to be quite different. A woman's role was to be married. This was her goal in life. As we see in this pot, as a bride, it moves from her mother's house, her father's house, to the house of her bridegroom, where we'd see on the other side of this pot, his mother waiting for him with the door open, leading to the bedroom where they'll consummate their marriage. A bride is seen as a victor, as a hero. And so the wreath that this figure, female figure with her white skin, is holding, this was her telos. This was her role in life. Women were traditionally inside the house in domestic activities, and hard work would be involved, as with the women making food over this pot fire, or the women weaving. It was work, and it was indoors, but it also was an opportunity for people to socialize with one another. We might also think of their singing songs, like one that Sappho had, in which she tells about a young girl telling her mother that she just can't weave anymore. She's so overcome with desire for a young boy. It's also a chance right there for learning traditions. And I like the one piece on the left, in which the young girl is holding, as it were, her mother's hand, as her mother is showing her how to do this domestic work. Hard work, yes, laborious, but still a chance for values to be transmitted and pleasure to be received in the company of others. And women did go outside. Important is their role in religion, which is sometimes not quite understood by people in our society, but was essential for the welfare of a city as well as a family and the individual. And I choose this pot because it's on a fillet. It's a bowl that would have been used in a religious ceremony in which some kind of liquid would be poured out onto the ground. As we see, this is a group of women who are all in a procession, a kind of dance, led by one woman and another woman who's playing the music in front of an altar at which the sacrificial offering would be made to the gods. Also, they're involved in something that is religious, something that could have political import, but also is a time to have fun, to play music, to dance, and to engage with one another. And I especially like this is the sense of fun right here. These aren't just these guest individuals, but real people. And we see this in this piece right here, because at the very end, there is one girl that's looking backwards at a smaller girl, possibly a younger girl. If she may be telling her, watch your step, you're doing something wrong, or she may be indicating her, that's good, keep on doing it, the kind of encouragement. It's this personal interaction among women that we don't always realize when we think about, just read about the role of women in ancient Greece. There's much more to it than has often in the past, at least, been acknowledged. And so Sappho was important in her period and throughout the period. I mentioned the 5th century and earlier authors, but she seemed also to have been very important in the Hellenistic period. A male poet, pastoral poet, Theocritus, actually used part of one of her poems, 31, in one of his idols. And the epic poet, Apollonius of Rhodes, was said to have relied on the image of Sappho in his poetry in the meeting of Jason with Medea. And most important, and if Marilyn Skinner is watching right here, I hope I don't butcher this interpretation, but we find that the woman Gnosis from the city of Locri in Italy had also composed a couple of poems, both that relate back to Sappho and even directly states her reliance on her. And in this poem, she says, "Oh stranger, if you sail to Mytilene, the city of beautiful dances, inspired by the flower," meaning the poetry of Sappho's graces, "tell that a Locrian woman bore someone dear to the muses. You should know that my name is Gnosis, and now go and tell that report." Sappho's repute follows through into the Roman period. And we find prominent there Catullus, who modeled one of his poems, 51 after Sappho 31, although he makes a very important change at the end. We also find that her metrics that she had supposedly created, although there's some controversy about that, was also followed by Catullus and another Roman poet from the period, the great Horace. Ovid also referred to Sappho, although he tends to look at more the lurid stories, and especially the ones that are very sentimental, and actually composed a letter that supposedly Sappho had composed to Phaon about how much she was suffering from his rejection of her. And then in the Roman period, we're also going to look at Longinus, about 100 CE, who refers to the supreme merit to Sappho's art in relation to this poem, number 31, that was copied and adapted by Catullus. And so we find that through the years in the antiquity, that people continue to talk about Sappho, to use what she had done. Sometimes it's about what she actually had written or composed, and others it was just the stories. But nonetheless, the stories about her, the tradition continued. So you might want to ask, well, how was this tradition? How did people come to know about her? According to what we know about Sappho, her poetry probably was not written down, although there was controversy, and some people do feel it was written down. But whether it was written down or not, certainly it was conveyed through the different performances, maybe at symposia, maybe at maybe at different festivals to, say, Aphrodite. And we find that in Athens in the 5th century, we do have the study of this being published along with a commentary. The poems are also continued through the Alexandrian collections. And we have an example of the Alexandrian period with this piece of pottery with one of the poems of Sappho, Sappho number 2 inscribed. This was found in Egypt, and Sappho 2 happens to be a poem that invites the goddess Aphrodite, one of the most beautiful poems of Sappho, to come in and join the festivities at this island. We also find that in later times that at some point it was written down on papyrus, as we see in this piece right here. And at later times, thank you, it was finally brought to mind just recently within the last decade. But it seems like, although it was also put down on parchment, that these papyrus and parchment are not very easy to maintain. And it's, at one point, we actually seemed to disappear around the 9th century. Some people argue this was because the sexuality of her poems was too offensive to the church. Others were that it just was too difficult, this Aeolic dialect. But although we don't have the physical remains of her poems from this period, we nonetheless have the story because they were kept alive by the different authors who wrote in the intervening years, men such as Dionysius of Halicarnassus. And then we do find that in addition to what was known earlier, conveyed through these later authors, that we found more poems of Sappho in these papyrus fragments found in the 19th century, first in the Egyptian Fayum, and then in the Oxyrhynchus papyrus. So we have then some transmission. Of course, great excitement is because of finding of these fragments, both in terms of 58 and then also some more information about her brothers. In Sappho's writings, we find that she's referred to in the later periods, moving on with the medieval period. Boccaccio, for example, wrote a book concerning famous women, De Claris Mulieribus, and put in that pictures of Sappho teaching men, Sappho surrounded by books, this learned figure. He's also going to be praised by the 16th century French poets. There's a group called La Pléiade, which would follow the Sapphic stanzas and refer to, give her honor by having a first person woman's voice. Our first English publication came up in 1652. And we find very important is going to be the poets of the Romantic period, which I'll talk about in later times. In much of this work, there is a sense of the central aspect of Sappho that is emphasized. But again, also there is this learned sense. We talked about Boccaccio. We also have this famous painting from the 19th century by Ingres, which is the apotheosis of Homer. And in this painting, we have all male luminaries from antiquity and from more contemporary times to the artists. Sappho is the only woman, and she's actually right here in the, between two men right here, because everyone else is a man. And we don't see too much of her, but maybe the depiction that other one later said about being a little dark nightingale right there, dark skin. These two females are going to be personifications of the different literary works, the epics of Homer. One is the Iliad and one is the Odyssey. But Sappho is the only figure that is female. So she stands out among all individuals, poets, authors, we have musicians, we have politicians. Interesting right here is not only do we have Pericles, but we also have Alcibiades, which is has a different kind of reputation in ancient Greece. And we see the different clothing, that the author was intentionally trying to represent that this was a panoramic view of all the great individuals here there to witness Homer's being made into a god. I mentioned the literary, and again, I'm just going to be able to give just a few examples of some of the literature reflecting Sappho. The one I chose right here, and looking for short ones because of the difficulty of the screen, especially if we just have a small screen. And this is a poem by Lord Byron, who is restating Sappho's poem, in which he has Hesperus bringing all which light-bringing dawn has scattered. You bring the sheep, you bring the goat, you to the mother. And then we see the longer description that we have with Bryant's, sort of this romantic view, bring us all good things, home to the weary, to the hungry cheer, etc. Only finally coming back to the last line, and that would be to the mother's breast. We'll also notice what's not there is a reference to the sheep or the goat. Somehow that didn't really quite fit his notion. Instead, we have the steer and we have the young bird, which I guess somehow hit his thought of what poetry was supposed to be about. We'll also find as we move forward in literature that in the late, well, moving into the early 20th century, that there's a move now from the Romanticism to a symbolism and imagism. This was a reactionary movement against Romanticism that emphasized simplicity, clarity of expression, and precision through the use of exacting visual images. An image that would present an intellectual and an emotional complex in an instant of time. And very influential here were the lyrics of the Greek poets and also of the Japanese haiku. And so we have right here the poem by Ezra Pound, in which we are going to have this one fragment of Sappho translated for the author. We're also going to find, and I've chosen here, another poem of Sappho, but a little bit lengthier, but one that was not only recreated by in a poem, but also this inspiration for a painting. And this is by Cy Twombly, which looks at the poem Sappho in 105, in which the reference to like a hyacinth, and then the reference to the mountain. And then we find in the end right there, the image right here of the purple, as it were, this purple hyacinth that's been all trampled by the feet of the shepherds. There's also, this also poem is one that we will find that is imitated in a certain way by the poet H.G., in which she refers to, using that same poem of Sappho, but here a wild hyacinth stalk is snapped, the purple buds half white, right, rather show deep purple where your heel had pressed. I mentioned H.D. because she's a part of the symbolist movement, but she's also an important representer of the interest that Sappho had for women's poetry. Women were seen in just the feminist movement. Sappho was seen as an image of a model for women's emancipation. She wasn't held back by the normal restrictions of women, concerned that women in the 19th and 20th century were feeling very strongly. And there's also this sense of sexual identity in Sappho with individuals. And I think also is the notion not just of sexuality, but just an openness of emotion. And so we find H.D. in her poem about actually welcoming Sappho right here, the wise Sappho. She talks about emotion differing entirely from any present day imaginable world of emotion, a world of emotion that could only be imagined by the greatest of her own countrymen and the greatest period of that country's glamour, who themselves confessed her beyond their reach, beyond their song, not a woman, but a goddess even, but a song, or the spirit of a song. And I think this is also one of the reasons that although H.D. was thinking in terms of this as a woman from the archaic period, finding possibly the restrictions in her own life, but I think also it ties in a topic that I believe is also relevant for male authors and male painters and artists as well that I'll be looking at in the paper that I'll be giving next. Well, Sappho's influence was not just among the English speaking, which I've been mentioning right here, but also we find that there was very much a strong European reception. A woman named Joan Dujon has written a very excellent book on that topic that I strongly recommend for those who would like to read more on the topic. We also find that the Russian modernists were influenced by Sappho. And some would say that Akhmatova, although she doesn't have any poem that I'm aware of that directly reflects Sappho, was seen to be influenced in the kind of attitudes that she had taken. We also will be finding more modern representations of Sappho in both movies and novels, books like Nancy Friedman on Sappho, The 10th Muse, of Greed, The Laughter of Aphrodite, and others of that sort. We also even have one by Lawrence Durrell, who wrote a Sappho, a play in verse. But now what I'd like to look at is that here is the movie that we have, Summer Lovers, and I thought the audience might be interested in the fact that actually we have Daryl Hannah right there playing a title role. This is not the first movie, and it's not the last movie. We have another one in the last decade, which a revision said was Summer Love, and there's actually one that is even earlier in the 21, and Sappho, Mad Lover. So we see this emotional influence that people are reflecting. But what I want to look at next as I prepare for my paper are the Greek authors. Certainly the Greeks, not surprisingly, are important figures. We find that in the 19th century, the person who stands out is Alexandros Zoutsos. And he actually had translated the poems of Sappho. But I also want to comment on the fact that sometimes we think of poets as individuals who sort of live a very separate life from that of the rest. But he actually had been one of the patriots. So when you're talking about the talks coming about the Greek Revolution, that he was one of the early partisans on behalf of Greek independence. We also find other Greeks such as Constantine Troponis, again, translating and adapting from Sappho. The article I really want to recommend most though is Demetrius Jacquez, because he is the one who is one of the primary figures who has looked at this tradition of transmission of Sappho, the reception of Sappho throughout the generations. And in one article that he had written the poem sets of Sappho in the 19th, 20th century, he points out a number of important artists, Solymus, Myrsilus, and also the famous Odysseus Elitis. And for this, I thank Stephanos for having given me a couple of YouTube references about some of his poetry and its recreation of Sappho. But what I want to look at most right here is his identification that what he's looking for in the Greek authors is not just looking at Sappho with the popular image right here, but Sappho instead as the mediating figure who endeavors through her poetic powers to give answers to the phenomena of life and death. Because this is what I believe is very important to keep in mind as I look now to my paper. The paper on this I'm going to be reading from is one that focuses on these four topics right here: Eros, desire; Kalon, the beautiful; Philia, friendship; Charis, grace; and Hebersune, luxuriousness or shining elegance. We've looked in what has gone before of how enduring Sappho's influence has been, which justifies her promise, someday Sappho will remember us. And now I want to turn to look at a selection of her poems. Very few are considered complete, and many consist of only a few uncontested lines. I argue, however, in my longer paper, from which this one comes, that coordinating the short poems with the longer ones reveals a comprehensive outlook, which can be seen to accord with what Atromonoklas has saying in contemporary Greek poets, giving answers to the phenomena of life and death. Integral in my approach is analyzing the dynamics of Eros, desire, love, and as I translate for Sappho, loving desire. Eros in ancient Greece was personified as a god who exerts an external influence on individuals. It also represented a personalized power, exercising its influence from within that individual. So the powerful force brings at times deep pain and a sense of overwhelming, life-threatening agony.
Do you have the message on what?
But activated in addition, should I wait?
No, okay.
Oh. But activated,
That's the message?
with activated addition are richly enjoyable experiences.
The
In both-
Facebook box, you say? The chat box? No, I cannot because the screen is taken. I have no access to the screen. Hello?
In both the initial activation and subsequent fulfillment, operative in Sappho is an enhanced appreciation of the beautiful, kalos. This adjective encompasses a broad spectrum of personal, social, aesthetic, and ethical features. In general, who or what is beautiful is perceived by the senses, evaluated in terms of the praiseworthy
Yes,
and
Stephanos.
pleasure. The evaluation includes subjective and objective factors, as that which arouses and is the cause of appreciation, and that which is the positive result or end. In addition,
Don't worry about that.
an individual's perception may look empathetically to another person's actual or potential reaction. This dynamic of physiology, cognition, emotion,
So just to make sure.
and interpersonal responsiveness
Then I leave you on. Yeah, that's fine. Yes. Yes.
what to do here.
Yeah. Type a message. It says, oh, Costas, I stopped your video. Savas called me and so on. So that's okay. No problem.
Costa, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. The dynamic of physiology, cognition, emotion, and interpersonal responsiveness leads to ethical considerations. What we identify as and how we respond to what we consider beautiful suggests the kind of character we have. When individuals enjoy and experience mutually, the relationship of friendship, philia, can develop with an exchange of mutual benefit, and the properties associated by Sappho with another concept, that of grace, charis. This term, associated with the Indo-European root ger, or pleasure, encompassed in ancient Greek diverse features: the attractive physical properties of a person, place, or thing, the delight an individual feels because of these properties, and the exchange experienced as an individual responds with pleasure to the person offering pleasure. Its potential for moving an individual to experience what touched on the divine is seen in the names and activities of the three goddesses who embody grace, that is, the three graces, the charites. Thalia, whose name refers to plenteousness or festivity, Euphrosyne, good cheer, and Aglaia, brightness. These goddesses' ability to enhance an individual's life in experiences comparable to what the gods enjoyed brings up my one more example of Eris's potential dynamics, that is of Habrasune, luxuriousness, or as translated by Bayerel, shining elegance, is the one I use. And so we're going to look at the first poem right here, in which Sappho identifies desire with the beautiful. She begins with the fact that some people say that a host of cavalry is most beautiful, others a host of foot soldiers or infantry, and still others a host of ships. That, they say, is most beautiful upon the black earth. But Sappho claims, I say, most beautiful is whatever someone desires. She goes on then to the example, very easy, very understandable, and that is of Helen, the individual who surpassed everybody with her beauty and left for another one person that she loved, that is Paris, the Prince of Troy. She left behind even that very best one, her husband. She sailed to Troy, and she did not even think about her child nor her beloved parents. It was love that led her astray. And so the poet says, this reminds me now of Anactoria, who's not here. I would rather see her desirable walk and the bright sparkle of her face more than the Lydian's chariot or the infantry, even with all their armament. And then Victoria is not away. And so something is not possible, but still the hope is pray that something might happen unexpectedly. So in this poem, this object of Sappho's desire, which he finds most beautiful, is this young woman, Victoria, who's referenced to her desirable way of walking, her bright sparkle of her face right here, conveys a sense of the young woman's vitality and the effect her appearance and personality could have on others. Her individuation is going to differ from that of the preceding examples of what or who can be considered beautiful. This intensifies the correlation between what is beautiful, how desire affects an individual, and why such are remembered. But we know from experience, desire is not always pleasant. After all, she's not here. As Sappho acknowledges, love is sweet bitter. It can bring pain, especially if the desire is not reciprocated or if the lover and beloved are separated. It can make you feel like you're going to get sick to your stomach, you're nauseated. It can make you feel like you're falling apart, the adjective Lucy Mellis right here. It may even make you feel like you can't do anything at all, or most powerfully, that you're even about to die. As Sappho in her most famous poem, 31, proclaims, although even there she has an option of how to deal with this in the following line that usually is not translated by the followers who otherwise translate that poem and just talk about the pain of love. And now we're also going to look at this phenomena of how she deals with it in the poem that follows. When love is reciprocated, life is good. Sappho sees this potential to operate not only in the present, but also in situations which seem to entail loss, as when a person moves away within Victoria, a situation often encountered by women in ancient Greece where a bride would be leaving her family. Sappho, however, provides an alternative perspective, an outlook that looks to the power of memory, which can keep love alive by recalling details about the beloved and the loving times that they had shared. And now I turn to my next poem, and that's going to be poem number 94. This poem opens with a proclamation, really, I want to die. Specifies suffering because of the individual having to leave against her will. But instead of grieving, Sappho turns to a different way, and she advises instead rejoicing, literally feeling charis or grace, through remembering the beautiful things, the kala, the two had experienced together. These good memories attest to love in the lines that follow of natural beauty and the body's central luxuries. She refers to wreaths that are made from violets and roses that are put on the beloved's head, flowery garlands that are draped around her neck, a perfume fit for a queen that anoints her body, and of lying on soft beds where the desire is released or satisfied. There's furthermore a sense of community. Sappho moves next in her concluding, however fragmentary, stanza from the bed with its sensual enjoyments to the pleasures of going to sacred places and groves where there's dancing and the sound of singing. The joyful explication of these personal and social memories provide a life-affirming rejoinder to the poem's opening lament, really I want to die, and the tearful regret of having to leave against her will. This recollection celebrates what the two women had done in the past and provides the means for continued pleasure. The act of remembering will connect them even when they are separated, and the formalized repetition through the poetic recitation or reading will reenact their love for still later times. Sappho told her beloved, you know how we have cared for you. This may refer to Sappho, those of others in her group, or future audiences which will read or hear these poems. While many poems, like the above and others, highlight the grace-filled relationship shared by individuals who are both women, I want to turn now to the celebration that Sappho makes of the joys of marriage. Noteworthy here is poem number 44, which recounts the details as she imagines it for the wedding of Hector and Andromache. The poem begins with the proclamation of a herald that Victoria is arriving, that Hector is coming with his friends to bring her. Andromache is described as glancing-eyed and brightly elegant. These adjectives attest her appearance and personalities, comparable with what we saw with Anatolia. She's come on a journey across the sea from a holy place, and she's brought with her evidence of great wealth. They're going to be silver and gold, silver and ivory cups. They're going to be gold jewelry, all these beautiful clothing. All the people unite to celebrate her arrival. They call on the gods' blessings. Greeting her are Hector's dear father, Priam, and his dear people. Young and old, men and women, royal and commoner, watch the glorious procession, smell these wonderful substances, frankincense, myrrh, cassia, like a kind of cinnamon right there. Hear musical instruments, sing their joy to the heavens, and invoke the gods' auspicious response. All are drawn into a kind of holy orbit and validate the poem's opening reference to the imperishable fame that will keep the memory of that wedding alive forever. Indeed, so splendid is the event, and the people sing a hymn to Andromache and Hector at the very end, or just like the gods. We know from traditional sources that their marriage will end in the tragedy of the Trojan War. Sappho doesn't look to that tragedy, though, but to the splendor of their love, the love that contrasts pointedly with that of the marriage for which this war was fought. Often associated with marriage, especially in ancient Greece, is the birth of children. And our next poem moves to a poem that is said to have been composed by Sappho for her daughter, Clais. In this poem, the narrator calls attention to her beautiful child. Aesthetic features stand out in the reference to her form, which is compared to golden flowers. Paramount through this, though, from the poem's first words, is the emotional appraisal. This individual is mine. She is to me, this beautiful child is to me, literally in the Greek. She is dearly beloved, and Sappho would not exchange her for all the Lydia or something that's desirable. Lydia was a byword for wealth and luxury. Clais's value for Sappho is more than monetary and more than anything else that might be desirable. Gold in this comparison right here with the gold flowers suggests superior status in Greek. It's associated with gods or people honored by the gods. Flowers symbolize physical perfection, sensual delights, the enjoyment of a good life. In this poem, verbal affirmation and symbolic representation work together to record how much Sappho cared for her beautiful child. The above poems emphasize the beauty and desire associated with people who are young. My final example now turns to what about when we grow old? Poems are by male poets will be decry the fact of getting old, although we do have one poem by Solon that says he's very happy he learns something new all the time. Old age is traditionally associated with debility and loss. Sappho, not surprisingly, has something else to say. And so in this poem, we're going to look at how Sappho begins with, which is not presented here, but I'm just going to summarize it, with praise for music and youth. She details, however, changes and limitations that are associated with growing old. She talks about how her black hair has turned white. Her skin used to be soft, but isn't anymore. That her limbs are no longer flexible and strong. She can't dance and do all the things she used to do. But she comes then to her conclusion, to a solution, through a way of thinking, which provides a way to rise above our naturally mortal limitations. As she proclaims in the final verses that we have right here, but I love shining elegance, and Eros has obtained for me the brightness and beauty of the sun. These two verses seem to contradict what she spoke of immediately before, but they provide, indeed, a fitting conclusion as to what we see in the examination of what this topic of shining elegance entails. In Sappho, it refers to the different qualities associated with the good life. There's a reference to Andromache that bride him to as a deity, of Adonis, a young man beloved by a deity, Aphrodite, the graces, those on themselves, the charites, and nectar, the drink of the gods. These positive implications receive further support in the poem, in which she identifies the causative role of Eros, of obtaining for her the light and the beauty of the sun, the source of light and life. The sun is bright and beautiful. It functions as that which is visible, and in the dynamic power illuminating and participating in the generation and growth of life. With this conclusion, Sappho turns the tables brilliantly on, or expands, general preconceptions about human life and the role of Eros. Even when an individual is no longer physically capable of what brought pleasure, she can realize nonetheless the shining elegance, recognize the beauty of what or who is desirable, and make beauty by sharing such appreciation with others. Desire, and this is the conclusion right now, desire in its full force is in one sense painful and self-annihilating. It reveals our failures to be self-sufficient, what we think of as independence. But this force can also drive us to a fuller realization of ourselves. We can appreciate in others what we lack. This appreciation makes possible in turn an appreciation of others appreciating us. And in this model, desire moves us outside of ourselves to try to make contact with others. The attempt, as well as the hope for union with another, can enhance our lives as we receive and give pleasure. Whether or not we're with our beloved, our desire, and even the memory of our desire brings us together. The desire we feel is like a light that shines forth from us and reveals a path by which others can reach us, but returns to us through them and illuminates us in turn, mutual and unending. So why do we remember Sappho? In my reading, most potentness or poetry is touching on what is rooted in our evolutionary past and carried forward through our genetic makeup. As identified by contemporary neurologists, emotional responses to beauty by our ancestors, going back to the Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, evolved to guide and encourage actions that improved our ancestors' chances of surviving and reproducing. This evolutionary perspective addresses perhaps the topic of why Sappho's poem focused most memorably on the power of love felt by a woman for another woman has been conveyed through the centuries by art and the writing of men who felt an identity with what she had to say, as well as the medium, interest in the medium through which she conveyed her thoughts. It perhaps this addresses what I see as an even larger topic, so relevant in our times, and that is how similar we are beneath the skin. So thank you very much for letting me share with you my thoughts about Sappho. And I hope that now you can join with Solon in appreciating what she has written. Though certainly you don't want to die right now. So now I'm open to any questions that you have. Custis.
Thank you very much, Professor Graham. I will read the questions in the order they have been presented. The first question is from Kathy Brock. What was the environment in which Sappho wrote? Was she living in a town, on a rural area? How else would you describe her background?
Well, Sappho does not ever talk about a city. And so it's interesting. It's usually, as we saw with the slides about women's lives, that she would have been within, her life would have been predominantly inside. But then we also have these other poems in which she's going outside. It's with the slide that showed the picture of these young women engaged in ritual sacrifice. And one of the poems I did get today, but again on the slides, I'd be glad to share them with everyone. I have, in addition to some extra sources, I've also had included the Greek text for the poems that I've provided the translations for. And I also included a couple other poems I didn't get to, including poem number 2. That was the one that was on that little pottery fragment. And that poem is another one of my favorite poems. And this is inviting Aphrodite to come to the sacred grove. And in this grove, there's references to the field. It's all the senses are involved. There's going to be in meadows nearby where there are horses running around. There are trees where the leaves are blowing and the wind is cooling you off. There are different flowers, as we've seen in the reference to in 44, where the woman is putting on these garlands and these wreaths of flowers right there. So when I look at where Sappho composed these poems, we can assume that they were composed. We don't know if they were inside or the outside, but certainly at different times. And again, Greece being a country, you want to be outside, you don't want to be inside all the time. And that there would be areas that would be outside the city in which they'd be able to go to these sacred places. To a certain extent, it's almost like some of the poems of not the poems, but the dialogues of Plato, in which we have different conversations taking place outside the city. So I think that I would place this something similar for Sappho. There also, Stephanos, you had shown me a couple of YouTubes that had to do with Elitis's translations and adaptations. But if you went to the next one, I can't remember which one it was, it actually has the, this is a couple decades ago, and in which we have groups of women, as it were, trying to recreate the poems of Sappho. And they're all out in a flowery meadow, such as Sappho describes in poem number 2, playing the lyre and singing all the little interaction around the women. So I think if you like, I'll be glad to supply that link for you as well to see how we imagine what the poems were like, but we don't know exactly what they were, the context in which they were performed.
Thank you. The second question is from Kostas Alagiorgas. What is the reception of Sappho in contemporary Greece?
I'm sorry, what part of Greece?
What is the reception of Sappho in today's Greece, in Greece today?
That I don't know. So, this is why Sappho to me is so fast. Well, anything in Greek literature is fascinating to me, just about anything, because there's always some other question that I need to address. For example, this whole story of the tradition is not one that I've spent a lot of time on. And so it's been fun to prepare that half of the talk, to look into it more. And that I don't know. Yatromanolakis goes down through, Elitis is the last person he refers to. And I don't know what would be after Elitis. So that's something else I have to learn. I will, as soon as I find out, I will send it.
Very good, thank you. The next question is by Julie. Is Sappho 16 perhaps a ring composition?
Yes.
There is the particular examples of ships, soldiers, and Sappho, and so on.
Yes, it's actually also said to have that poetic phenomenon known as a preamel. And this is something we find the Greek poets and later poets as well, in which a poet will introduce a topic at the beginning of the poem and then use it as a point of departure of how this poet thinks something is completely different. And so the beginning is that some people think these Lydian military facilities are all what is most beautiful. And interesting in that, as part of going into the ring composition, because of course she returns to that in the end, is the notion that what people think is beautiful in armies and navies, and the foot soldiers, right, the infantry, really can be tied in imaginatively with what Sappho praises in Anactoria. And that is the sense of movement and of brightness, because we can imagine the sun shining on this gleaming army. The Greeks would have been all arrayed in all their bronze equipment right there. And so this is what some people think is most beautiful, looking at these vast numbers of men. I mean, why do we still like to have parades of soldiers right now? This is, it's wonderful. And they're all moving and light. And again, light is so important in Sappho's poetry because light is a source of life. There's actually a word, the Greeks, in ancient Greeks, I don't know how this is for modern Greeks, but in ancient Greek, there are a number of words for being a person. One of the basic words for being a person is, and this is in general, for not looking into gender distinctions, is that we are the mortai, we are the ones, thanatoi, we are the ones that are going to be dying. The athanatoi, the ones who don't die, are the gods right there. Then another way that people are distinguished from the gods is that we are the brotoi, we are the people who eat bread. The gods have ambrosia, which is not bread. And then still another way is that it's not exactly the same word, but in the Greek, it would sound the same right there, or close to the same. And that is going to be that the word for light, phos, and the word for a person, phos, are going to be sounding very much. And again, the notion in the Greeks of being alive is seeing the light. To be born is to come into the light. To die is to leave the light. And so the fact that the cavalry and the infantry and the naval ships right there are all seen as movement and seen as reflecting the sunlight is a kind of beginning point for Sappho then talking about this one woman. And she specifies her way of moving her step, and then also the bright gleaming gleam of her face. She's full of life.
Thank you. There is another question from Julie. Do we find two notions of eros being reflected here? We seem to find eros as sexual desire and also eros as avrosini.
Okay.
Which is eros? Okay, please.
Finish your question, sorry.
Which is eros tempered by phronesis, reason, which is the wiser idea of eros reached in later age.
Yes, and I think that's the very important question, and one I really address in detail in my longer paper right there, because eros is very much a very central movement in Sappho, referring to, for example, anactoria. On the other hand, it's also not really sexual, certainly when we're talking about ships and soldiers as a mass right there. But I think it's the sense of eros that Sappho represents, is the sense of moving outside yourself. This is a topic that David Halperin looks into in his work on the Plato, which I'm sure Julie knows quite a lot about and could talk in detail about. And I think that Sappho is sort of moving from the sexual, but looking at also this way that goes forward. And this is also why we find that Plato refers to Sappho's view of eros in his Phaedrus.
Very good, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Because I don't see anything else on this list. Stephanos, do you have anything from Facebook?
No, I didn't see anything. Let me check once again.
Okay.
Well, there is one song I can play if we don't have any other questions. And this is the one by Chagall. And actually, I have to thank one of my former students, Melly Ramirez, who brought this to my attention in a course a couple of years ago on women in the classical world. And I didn't realize that there was anything like this, and this is certainly nothing like anything we imagined for Sappho. And so if you'd like, I'd be very happy to show that when, if we do have a couple more minutes, so YouTube.
Yeah, go ahead. We don't really have any more questions on Facebook.
Okay, then let me ask one question, then you can go to
Okay.
the video. If I remember well, in one of your slides, you mentioned something that Sappho, she had written against women of strong political personalities.
Yes.
Is
yes.
that correct? So were these women playing a different role than the typical role of a woman in the ancient Greek society?
Well, we don't really know about these women. And actually a man named Parker has written an article in the book of essays by Ellen Green, which really has some very thoughtful articles in that. And Sappho refers to a number of women who seem to be, the way she describes them, seems pretty, very feminine. She's accusing some woman of the way she has her dress, it doesn't hang right. And then she's also referring to women who she feels like a girlfriend, like, oh, she doesn't like me anymore. She's somebody else's friend right now. And so it seems very trivial. But then when you find out who this person is, the name is given, that it turns out that she's actually from an important family. And so this may be a woman's way of putting down another family. Because again, keeping in mind the dynamics in this society in which a woman is not going to be able to vote. She's not going to be able to hold any public office. In Athens, she couldn't make a will. She couldn't earn any money that would be more than what a family could make in live on a 1 week. It was very, very limited. All the decisions would be made by her male guardian, whether it's her father, her husband, her son. It's very limited right there. And so, but women aren't going to be participating in ways that we might think are trivial, but could have been very effective back in that time.
Of course.
We have a couple of more questions on Q&A.
Okay.
I guess Chagall will have to wait then.
Oh, okay, another one. Who is HP is the question by Patricia Camberos.
Yeah,
Who is
Hilda,
HP?
her name is Hilda Doolittle. And she was actually involved in this Imagist movement, very much involved with a poet named Aldington, and then also Ezra Pound, and she married him at some point or the other. So this was the early, in the last century, the 20th century.
Okay, the next question is by Andriana Economou. Sappho's poetry is mostly in phrases and quotations.
Yes.
Is there any possibility to get a sense of the full body of her work?
Originally, there were not, some would say 8, some would say 9 books. We have actually some of the information that supposed information that comes back to us is from the Swedes, which is I think the 9th or 10th century CE. And that says that they have, I can't remember if it was 8 or 9 books, because there's a debate as to whether there are 8 or 9 books of her poetry. So we have really so very little poetry of hers. It's argued that poem number 1 is the only complete poem that we have. The last section that I read from that 58 is actually a really exciting poem, because we had, last it were one half of the poem in terms like looking at the page, and half the page we had words, and then the other half of the page we couldn't tell what it was. The papyrus had been torn, or whatever it was, you couldn't read it. And then, was it early this like last decade, they actually found another papyrus that fits with it and had, as it were, the other half of this poem right here. So we have a pretty complete poem, but even that becomes debated, because we have different sources that will have different poems at the lines at the beginning of this, and not the lines at the end that I quote. And so Naj and others argue that originally in the transmission of the poems, that sometimes they might sing one version of the song with the beginning and not the end, just end up, this actually talks about the fact that Tithonus, loved by a goddess, nonetheless grows old, even though he's going to live forever. And they ended that part, a sort of very negative view of life. Others end with the section that I had right here, a very positive, what I argue is a very positive view, that even we're old, we can still find something beautiful and enjoy it.
Do we have any picture of what really a book was in terms of pages or anything of that? What was considered a book at the time?
It would have been a papyrus roll, my understanding. Then we got parchment, etc., but that's later.
Okay.
One more question came, one related question came from Julie.
Okay,
Yes.
let's hear what Julie has to say.
Why is ancients, okay, a quick question. Why, if ancients valued Sappho so much, was so little of her work preserved?
This is what we don't know, and whether it was because of the churches against the sexuality that was proposed, and is it because that the dialect was just so difficult, the Gaelic? It's like when I'm translating Sappho, I have to go back and forth between my different dictionaries to find out exactly what is this word.
Yeah. And the next question is it true that in ancient Greece, the term lesbian referred to heterosexual relations and not homosexual relations?
Well, we don't have, I don't know what the earliest word lesbian comes from. It's usually referred to somebody from Lesbos. And so the poem by Anacreon, which again is close to Sappho's time, which is argued to show that he knew about her poetry, and refers to this poet Anacreon, who actually goes after in his poem. He's interested in both other young men and young women. And his reference to being interested in one young girl is the fact that she makes fun of him, but then he's not surprised because she comes from the island of Lesbos. And so this would seem to be indicating what we refer to as lesbianism.
Very good, thank you. It seems that there is no any other question, so we could go to your video.
Okay, this is just a 2-minute one. And I think it'd be sort of fun to show how this influence has continued.
Sure.
And again, thanking my student, Melly.
To me, the man who sits across from you
Oh, next I can show
is
you.
a God. He listens carefully to your delicious voice and your laughter. And if I meet you suddenly, my tongue breaks up and I can't speak. A thin flame runs under my skin. There's only noise, can't see a thing. Cold sweat rushes down on me and trembling seizes me. I'm paler than the grass drying, oh yes it seems. I'm dying, dying, dying,
Thank you. Okay, so with this, we finish our lecture. Thank you very much for attending the lecture. And we're looking forward to see you at the next one. Thank you very much. Professor Graham, if you would like, you can stay on. Stefanos?
Yes, I'm here. I'll let you know when the attendees, or we can start talking. I mean, there's some attendees left, 41 attendees.
Okay, can you disconnect?
Yeah, I'll disconnect them.
Should I just connect myself to it? Did I go over my time? Yes, very much.
Takes a while.
Oh, okay.
Have to do one at a time.
You're muted.
Sappho, I'm going to leave you in and I'm going to promote you.
Oh, my mom just switched on her.
Okay, Sappho's disappeared, so I'm going to see if I can invite him again.
Okay, they say three. Oh, the three are the three of us.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Patricia. That was a beautiful lecture. We had a very, very good attendance, about 100 people.
Wow.
Yeah, that's very impressive.
And more than 50%, more than 50 of them were people that we are not familiar with. They had American names, let's say. So they must be your connections,
I don't know.
Patricia.
Oh, it's also the other day, the National Women's Group.
Oh, yeah.
that They joined the event. So thank you very much. And we hope to see you again around and possibly to have some other event in the future.
I would be happy to talk again.
Yeah. What other topics are you talking about?
Well, anything that has to do about Greek lyric poetry. I love poetry.
Oh, okay.
I can also, the role
Does
of women,
this
of course, is what I
is
know
just
best.
poetry, or in the broader sense includes tragedy and comedy and so on?
Yes. I haven't taught tragedy in a couple of years. I've taught it as a class. Right
Okay.
now, my course is on archaic Greece, is
Okay.
what I teach. And of course, that's so much fun because it involves not just the role of women. The role of women is a very small part of it, but
Okay.
just the notion of justice, just about anything has to do with Greek society.
Now, when you say the notion of justice, it has to do with the notion of justice towards the women or in general?
In general, yes.
In general, that's an interesting subject.
Another talk I've written.
Do you have a paper on this?
No, I don't. I have one
Okay.
though on, I have a paper on the Homeric hymn to Hermes, which is really fun. So this
Okay.
is the story of how the god Hermes
Yes.
was born. The first thing he does, he wants to steal his brother's cattle.
Okay.
And so, but before he goes to steal, he's a little kid. So before he steals the cattle, he goes and he steps out of the house and he sees some turtle. He takes the turtle, he kills it, he makes a lyre out of it. Then he goes and steals his brother's cattle, comes back home and pretends to be a baby. Apollo comes, somehow able to find out who has stolen his cattle, and comes and demands them back. And you have this interchange between Hermes and Apollo. Hermes defending himself, saying, how could I possibly do something like that? I'm a little baby, I'm here in my cradle, I'm just, I don't know what cows are. And Apollo, sure. And so then they decide to go up to Zeus